Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of Indian pressure groups.
It's going to be a fascinating look at how these groups wield their influence in Indian politics.
Absolutely. And whether you're prepping for the UPSC exam or just want to understand the inner workings of Indian politics a bit better, this deep dive is for you.
We'll be drawing on an insightful academic text that breaks down the types and strategies of these pressure groups.
So to kick things off, can we just define what exactly are pressure groups?
Sure, they're basically organized groups of people who want to influence government policy, but they're not trying to actually hold office themselves.
Gotcha. So they're not trying to win elections, but they're definitely trying to make their voices heard.
Exactly. They're like the power brokers working behind the scenes.
Interesting. And what are some of the main ways they try to exert their influence?
Well, according to our source material, pressure groups rely on three main techniques.
Okay, lay them on me.
The first is electioneering.
So basically backing candidates who support their cause.
Right. Then there's lobbying, which is all about directly persuading officials to adopt policies that are favorable to them.
So that's where the pressure in pressure groups really comes into play.
Exactly. And finally, there's propagandizing.
Propagandizing. So shaping public opinion to indirectly influence the government.
You got it.
And all of these tactics are especially effective in a democracy like India's, where public opinion and elections really matter.
Absolutely. These groups are experts at navigating the democratic system to amplify their voices.
Fascinating. Okay, so our source breaks down Indian pressure groups into different categories. Should we jump into exploring those now?
Let's do it. I think looking at some real-world examples will help bring these categories to life.
Okay, perfect. Let's start with the big players, the business groups.
Right. Groups like FICCI and ASOCHAM, these are the heavy hitters representing big industries and often having a lot of financial clout.
Yeah, those are some powerful organizations. So how do they actually use their influence to impact policy?
Well, their lobbying efforts can be really effective.
In what way?
For example, FICCI's advocacy for corporate tax cuts played a key role in persuading the government to implement those reductions.
Interesting. So they basically use their resources and expertise to make a strong case for their position.
Exactly. And it resulted in a more business-friendly environment.
That's a great example of how these groups can translate their agenda into actual change.
It is, and it highlights the significant influence they can wield on economic policy.
Okay, let's move on to another category, trade unions.
Now, these are fascinating because in India, they often have close ties to political parties.
Like how so?
Well, for instance, you have AITUC, which is affiliated with the Communist Party of India.
Okay.
And then there's INTUC, which is linked to the Congress Party.
So there's like a built-in political connection.
Exactly. And that can definitely affect their strategies and their effectiveness when advocating for workers.
So what kind of things do they typically advocate for?
Well, they fight for things like better wages, better working conditions, and job security for industrial workers.
And do they always get their way?
Not always. Sometimes their actions can lead to strikes and disruptions, which highlights the whole power dynamic between labor industry and the government.
It's like a constant push and pull.
It is, and it's a really important part of the Indian political landscape.
Okay, so we've talked about business groups and trade unions. What's next?
Let's talk about agrarian groups. These are crucial in a country like India where agriculture is so important.
Absolutely. And we see groups like the Bharatiya Kisan Union really making their presence felt when it comes to agricultural policy.
They're really effective at advocating for farmers' rights, pushing for things like subsidies, loan waivers, and fair prices for their produce.
Right. They've been at the forefront of debates on things like genetically modified crops.
Exactly. They're playing a crucial role in shaping policy decisions that impact millions of farmers.
Okay, so next we have professional associations.
Right. These groups act as guardians of their professions, ensuring ethical practices and representing their members' interests.
So like the Indian Medical Association and the Bar Council of India.
Precisely. They're all about upholding standards and advocating for the needs of their respective professions.
Got it. And then we have student organizations.
And these are super interesting because just like trade unions, they often have strong affiliations with political parties.
So we see that connection again.
We do.
Yeah.
You have ABVP, which is linked with the BJP,
Right.
and NSUI, which is associated with the Congress Party.
So it's like a microcosm of national politics playing out on campuses.
Exactly. And these organizations often serve as training grounds for future political leaders.
That makes sense. Okay, now let's move into a slightly more sensitive area, religious and caste groups.
Right. These groups, like the RSS, Jamaat Islami, and various caste-based organizations, wield significant influence in India.
And they can definitely shape electoral outcomes and government policies.
They can, but their actions can also sometimes spark debate about things like communalism and social divisions.
So it's a complex and often sensitive area to navigate.
It is. It's a reminder of the deep connections between religion, caste, and politics in India.
Okay, and what about tribal and linguistic groups?
Well, these groups often face unique challenges as they advocate for cultural recognition, resource rights, and political representation.
Like the NSCN and Tamil Sangh, for example.
Exactly. They're pushing for the needs of specific communities within the larger Indian context.
And it highlights the diversity of India and the complexities of managing that diversity within a democratic framework.
It definitely does. It's a constant balancing act.
Okay, so next we have ideology-based groups. These seem to be gaining more prominence lately.
They are. These groups are focused on specific causes like environmental protection or human rights.
So like Narmada Bachao Andolan, for instance.
Exactly. They're often at the forefront of social movements, and they're really good at using public awareness campaigns and media outreach to get their message across.
So they're like issue-specific advocates.
We could say that. They're all about pushing for change on the issues they care about most.
Okay, and finally we have anomic groups. These are a bit different, right?
These are more like spontaneous bursts of discontent.
So not your typical organized group.
Right. They're often fueled by frustration or a sense of injustice, and they can sometimes lead to things like riots or demonstrations.
Like the All India Sikh Students Federation or Naxalite groups?
Exactly. And while their actions can be disruptive, they can sometimes force the government to address issues that might have been ignored otherwise.
It's like a pressure valve releasing pent-up frustrations.
That's a great way to put it. And it shows how even in a democracy, sometimes people need to resort to more drastic measures to make their voices heard.
So we've got this whole spectrum of groups, from the highly organized to the more spontaneous, all trying to influence policy and shape the direction of India.
And it makes for a dynamic and fascinating political landscape. It's amazing how all these groups with their different backgrounds and goals all come together with this shared aim of influencing policy and really shaping the future of India.
It's like a giant tapestry.
Yeah.
With each thread representing a different interest, but all woven together to create this complex fabric of Indian democracy.
I like that analogy.
Thanks. So how do they actually make their voices heard? We touched on electioneering, lobbying, and propagandizing earlier.
Yeah, let's unpack those a bit more. Starting with electioneering.
Right.
In India's super competitive elections, the support of a well-organized pressure group can really make or break a candidate.
Yeah, that makes sense. But how do they actually go about it? Do they just tell their members who to vote for?
It's a bit more strategic than that.
Oh, okay. How so?
They can mobilize their members to vote for candidates who align with their cause.
So they can really sway election results.
They can. They might organize rallies, put out pamphlets, or even go door-to-door campaigning for certain candidates.
Wow. So it's like a targeted campaign within a campaign.
You got it. They focus on issues that resonate with their members.
And I'm guessing they also contribute financially to campaigns too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Money talks in Indian elections and pressure groups can really leverage their resources to support candidates who will advance their agenda.
So it's kind of a double whammy, votes and funds.
Exactly. It gives them leverage during those crucial election cycles.
Okay, let's talk about lobbying. This is where they get a bit more direct, right?
Right. Lobbying is all about direct interaction with government officials, policymakers, legislators, you name it.
They're taking their case straight to the decision makers.
They are. Presenting evidence, research, persuasive arguments, the whole 9 yards.
But lobbying sometimes has kind of a negative connotation, right? Like it's all about shady backroom deals.
Yeah, it definitely gets a bad rap sometimes, and there have been cases where it's crossed the line into corruption.
Right.
But it's important to remember that lobbying, when done ethically, can actually be a valuable tool in a democracy.
How so?
Because it ensures that diverse voices and perspectives are taken into account when policies are being made.
So it's all about finding that balance between advocating for your interests and respecting the democratic process.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about propagandizing? That one always sounds a bit manipulative to me.
Well, at its core, propagandizing is about shaping public opinion.
Okay.
It's about winning hearts and minds, creating a climate of support for their cause.
Got it.
They might use things like public awareness campaigns, media outreach, social media, to influence how people view certain issues.
So it can be a powerful tool, but also one that can be misused.
For sure. There's a fine line between informing the public and manipulating them.
Right, like where do you draw that line?
Exactly. It's a constant debate.
Okay, so we've talked about their techniques, but let's talk about their impact.
Yeah.
How have these pressure groups actually shaped Indian politics and
Oh,
society?
their impact is huge and multifaceted. They've influenced everything from economic policies to social reforms to environmental regulations, you name it.
Wow.
Their actions have resulted in actual changes in legislation, government policies, even societal attitudes.
Can you give us some concrete examples of their impact?
Yeah, of course. Think about the Narmada Bucko Andolan, for example.
Right.
This was a big environmental movement that challenged the construction of dams on the Narmada River.
Right.
And it was fueled by the efforts of various NGOs and activists.
Right.
They brought attention to the social and environmental costs of these big development projects, and it led to some significant policy changes.
So they had a real impact.
They did. And it shows how a pressure group, even one outside of traditional political structures, can really bring about change.
That's a great example. Any others?
Sure. Think about women's rights organizations in India.
Okay.
They've been instrumental in advocating for legal reforms to protect women from things like domestic violence and discrimination.
Right.
And their efforts have led to real progress in advancing gender equality.
It's inspiring to see how these groups can challenge the status quo
Mhm.
and push for positive change. But haven't there also been some negative consequences of their involvement?
That's a good point. There's no denying that sometimes their actions have contributed to social and political tensions.
How so?
Well, advocating for specific interests can sometimes be at odds with the broader well-being of society.
Right.
And some of their tactics, like disruptive protests or using inflammatory rhetoric, can actually make divisions in society worse.
So it's important to make sure they're being accountable and transparent.
Exactly. Their role in a democracy is vital, but it needs to be done responsibly.
Okay, so let's look ahead. What's the future of pressure groups in India? It seems like a constantly evolving landscape.
It is. New groups are emerging all the time, driven by new issues and concerns.
Right.
And existing groups are having to adapt their strategies to the changing political and social realities.
So what are some key trends we should be paying attention to, especially for those listeners who are prepping for the UPSC exam?
Well, one major trend is the rise of issue-based groups.
Issue-based groups.
Yeah. These groups are laser-focused on specific causes like environmental protection, human rights, animal welfare, things like that.
Okay.
They're attracting a lot of young activists, and they're really good at using social media to get their message out there.
So it's like a new generation of activism.
Exactly. Very focused and tech-savvy.
Are there other trends we should be watching?
Yeah. Another big one is the growing importance of coalition building.
What do you mean?
Pressure groups are realizing that they can be more effective by working together,
Oh, interesting.
pooling their resources, presenting a united front,
Yeah, makes sense. Strength in numbers.
Exactly. And finally, I think there's a growing awareness among these groups of the need for transparency and accountability.
Oh, that's good.
They're realizing that they need public trust to be effective.
Yeah, that's key.
So they're becoming more open about their funding, their lobbying activities, their decision-making processes,
Yeah.
Trying to be more transparent.
It's like they're moving from being seen as these shadowy, behind-the-scenes players to being more accountable to the public.
Right. And that's a positive step for Indian democracy.
Wow, we've really explored a lot today.
We have.
From those big business groups to student activists, from farmers' rights advocates to those groups who are really pushing the boundaries on development projects, it's clear that these pressure groups play such a key role in India.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand how these dynamics work, whether you're thinking about a career in policymaking or you're a future bureaucrat, or even if you just want to be a more informed and active citizen.
Right. And especially for those listeners who are gearing up for the UPSC exam, this deep dive has hopefully given you a good framework for analyzing how these groups function within Indian democracy.
It's not just about memorizing facts for the exam, though. This knowledge helps you be a more informed and engaged citizen, period.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up, let's turn it back over to you, the listener.
Think about everything we've talked about today.
With all these diverse and powerful groups out there, how do you think they contribute to, or maybe sometimes hinder, the functioning of Indian democracy?
Do they always operate ethically, or do they sometimes use tactics that go against those democratic values?
Do they really represent the voices they claim to speak for? Or are they sometimes more focused on pushing their own narrow interests?
Tough questions.
They are tough questions, and there are no easy answers.
Mm.
But wrestling with these questions is so important if we want to build a more just equitable and truly vibrant democracy.
And understanding the ins and outs of these pressure groups, their motivations, their strategies, their impact, it all helps you be a more informed and engaged citizen. You can cut through the noise, analyze what's happening politically, and participate in the democratic process in a more meaningful way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Indian pressure
It's
groups.
been a fascinating journey.
I hope you found it insightful and maybe even inspiring.
Until next.
Until next time, stay curious and keep those brains buzzing.